let me tell you something. You don't hate the white man. You don't even fear them. Because if black people hate and fear the white man the way they hate and fear each other, you would all have left this country at the end of slavery.
Left this country and go where?
Go where?
Yeah.
Where did the Jews go to? Do you know how many lands in Africa was offered to African Americans through the Black Star Line project? It was funded by a British through Marcus Garvey and Kwame Nkrumah, the Black Star Line. Did you go? No. How did you get the Amerigo Liberia culture move back? 3,400 people only agreed to go to Liberia. What do you mean where to?
What do you call what we built after slavery? What do you call that?
Well, you have to give me an example of what you mean by what we build.
So they took French and made Creole, right? Is what you're saying.
Spanish, French, and then over 200 African tribal languages into one.
But Americans would say that they took English and made their own language as well.
And what is that?
I mean, it's a broken version of English, but it's still something that we could speak to that's specifically to us.
What language is that?
I mean, it's English.
He's talking about...
What that is saying?
Guys, this is a high-tension conversation between Franck Zanu and these African Americans. I don't know who they are. Many of us on the continent of Africa here do not know who they are. But what we see is that we are trying to understand some of the challenges we're seeing in South African society, where blacks, whites, Indians, and coloureds live together. We're seeing the same dynamics in America, where African Americans and blacks, and maybe many other cultures, but the African Americans and the whites actually have a lot in common with the kind of dynamics we begin to see in South Africa, all right? And so Franck Zanu, being just like me, foundational African black, born on the continent, raised on the continent, eating African food, had, our worldviews, especially, although Franck Zanu argues that, we do not have the worldviews in the nation state, but we had our worldviews. I'm ethnically Igbo. Franck Zanu would argue that he's ethnically Agbome, which is a tribe in Benin, right? So we have our worldviews from here before moving out of the continent to experience the Western world, right? Now, in encountering African Americans, Franck Zanu is beginning to understand, and he's actually trying to share to us that, there's a certain level of anger, there's a certain level of emotions, right, that makes it difficult to have a really fluid discussion with the African Americans he's actually engaging with in the United States. It's the same thing I also experienced as a foundational African working or trying to speak to black South Africans in South Africa, all right? There's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of anger. You dare not touch this, you dare not talk about the land, you dare not talk about, our history, you dare not talk about the white people. So South Africa and the United States have a really similar, and this is my understanding, the more I listen to Franck Zanu and the more I understand these two societies. South African society, where there's a mix of Africans, blacks, whites, Indians, and coloureds, and then the United States, where there's the African Americans, the whites, and more other societies, they have a lot in common. And one of them is this emotional divide, right? Where it makes it difficult for blacks and whites to sit together and speak because of slavery. In South Africa, it would be apartheid, all right? We in Nigeria, for example, we had colonialism in Francophone Africa, Burkina Faso, Niger, the Sahel. They had French colonialism as well. So we have Francophone and Anglophone countries. But these two societies, the US and South Africa, are very, very unique because of the fact that after slavery in the US or after apartheid in South Africa, the blacks and the whites still remain stuck in one space, and they had to see themselves every day, and they had to build something, a relationship, a society out of that bitterness and the trauma and the anger. They had to somehow get beyond that and build, which is a really difficult task. In fact, recently, the minister of DIRCO in South Africa, Ronald Lamola, I think it's the Department for International Relations and Cooperation, something like that. He argued that it has really been difficult in South Africa to build a society out of the ruins of apartheid and out of the ruins of colonialism, and the blacks and the whites now trying to work together to build government. I think this is the same thing I'm beginning to see in the United States. It has a lot of emotions, a lot of anger, and I think that's where Franck Zanu now finds himself as a foundational African who has got into that space and trying to make sense of everything around him. He's experiencing African Americans really, really emotional, really difficult to speak to logically, just like I would also encounter a lot of black South Africans in South Africa, really emotional and, really difficult to have logical discussions and all that. And at the end of the day, my conclusion is that in South Africa, until the blacks and the whites are able to come together, sit on the table and address these bitter issues, with honesty, logic, and, in a safe space. Really, we're not moving forward. We're not going to move forward. I tell you that for free. And that's why I created this channel, to bring a space where we can have a kind of like a discussion. That's the originality of this channel. Many people think that I usually have these discussions from these guys and I don't make original content. No, the originality of this channel is that it provides a space where we can see these dichotomies between whites and blacks, the bitterness, the trauma, the generational trauma. How does that affect our daily lives, both as whites and blacks? Because I tell you, a lot of white people in my DMs coming to me and telling me, dude, I don't understand why the whole world blames me for all the problems in the world. These are white people, whites in South Africa, whites in the United States. They are frustrated, they are confused. They don't understand why it is that they seem to be blamed for everything, for colonialism, for slavery and all that. I think this is why these discussions have to continuously go on. All right, so Franck Zanu is coming from the perspective, all right, that he's arguing that the hatred African Americans might have for the United States or, for white people in the US isn't necessarily targeted at white people. In other words, he's arguing that blacks in South Africa, blacks in the United States do not hate white people, because if they did hate white people immediately after slavery, immediately after all of that oppression from the 1650s all the way to the 1850s, I usually like to explain that in 1833, the British passed the law for abolishment of slavery, and the United States cut off in 1865 thereabout. But Franck Zanu is of the opinion that if these guys had actually gone through these long years of oppression, right, and immediately they got freedom, what really then made it difficult for them to return back to the continent to really experience the freedom they once cherished, all right? So this is Franck Zanu's argument, not my argument. Now, a lot of the African Americans would come back and argue that, okay, if you want us to return after 400 years, what happens to what we built in the United States? What happens to all of the labor, all the resources, all of the energy we put in the cotton plantations and all that to build all this wealth in the United States? That's a really powerful argument. That's a powerful dichotomy. How do we address that? I think that's what this discussion is all about. And it's the same in South Africa, because in South Africa, we have the apartheid regime. It started from 1910, all right, from the establishment of the Union of South Africa under the British colonialism, when we see that the blacks complain about the Natives Lands Act of 1910, where land, some large swaths of land, right, was shifted away from, communal use by the black people, and was shifted towards, a more economic use, all right? This is the perspective the likes of Julius Malema and many black Pan-Africanists in South Africa come from. That's where the land was stolen. If you remember my last video, Franck Zanu argues that land cannot be stolen, but that's the perspective. They argue that land was taken away from them, right? And now in South Africa, there's a push that we want the land back, all right? Now, Franck Zanu is of the opinion that if African Americans really had that long time being oppressed, all right, it should have been easy to return back to the continent, to come and get all this land with all the wealth and all that. But the African Americans would argue that they started from ground zero. It was like, starting from the beginning, and then with all that they had built, they just couldn't leave all of that and return back. The ships, I think Marcus Garvey and Kwame Nkrumah, the Black Star Line, as he argues, wanted to bring all these African Americans back to the continent, but a lot refused. They wanted to stay in the United States. And those are really sensitive discussions that, we have to try to understand, because I've seen a lot of African Americans trying to, especially since the last 3 years, I think Ghana launched a program called The Great Return, or was it The Great Return? Yeah, one of those a theme like that. Anyway, a lot of African Americans have been coming to the continent, in Kenya, in Ghana, a lot of places, but they slowly started understanding or experiencing the difficulty many foundational Africans like us really have in trying to connect with the appropriate empathy they would have expected as descendants that left the continent, as descendants of people who left the continent in a transatlantic slave trade from 1650 to 1850, all right? And so when they come into Africa, they really do not understand why many Africans do not, and that's exactly what I see in Franck Zanu. We have this impatience in a way of trying to, we have this impatience of, that kind of whole victimhood narrative and all that. It's something that really doesn't sit well with us. Not as if we do not connect to the trauma that African Americans have experienced, but we just do not have that patience, with those kinds of discussion. I think that's the struggle a person like Franck Zanu in the United States is actually experiencing, and that's what we see in this studio. So it's really important that we watch it. We are watching this from Africa. We're trying to understand, South Africa, but now I see that we also have to understand the African Americans and the relationship with African Americans and the whites, those are blacks and the whites in the United States, so that at least we can get a common understanding of how we all can live together in this really complex, difficult world and move forward and progress as humanity. So let's quickly listen, guys, and share your thoughts in the comments.
So, Frank, let me ask you a question. If slavery erased our Black Americans' culture, what do you call what we built after slavery? What do you call that?
Well, you have to give me an example of what you mean by what we build. What are you referring to?
You tied culture back to African and something that you inherit, but you said that got erased during slavery, but we built something clearly Black Americans have built throughout slavery and the culture that we have currently.
What I'm asking is, give me an example so I'll be able to respond to that particular thing.
Well, like things like gospel is something that we built after slavery.
Songs and music,
the foods that we eat, that we consume.
Sure, songs and music exist in every society.
Is that not a part of culture?
No. Let me come to that. And first, let me make a little response to David's assertion that we were not allowed. So, in Benin or Ghana or Nigeria, you pick any of the 54 countries in Africa, right? If you had gone into a Yoruba tribe, which is now part of Nigeria, they would speak Yoruba. Now, when we were put together forcefully as countries, today, my nieces and nephews can't even speak my language properly. And the French and English, they can't even speak it properly. Because in one classroom, you have 36 kids who come from different tribes in that classroom. So they can only use English or French or Spanish or Portuguese to teach this myriad of tribes now who don't speak their language anymore. African Americans were not prevented from speaking their language. When the ship arrived, it was one from this tribe, that tribe, that tribe, that tribe. So automatically you can speak to each other. And when you don't speak your language for a while, like I've been outside Africa now, going 40 years. If I meet any of my uncles and I start to try to speak my language, I'm interfered by English constantly, and I can't finish it. I can't make a coherent sentence in my own language because at school, you could not use that language because you are now a bucket of different languages. The same thing happened here. You were brought as a shipload of different languages. That is why Creole and Patois were created. So you use the only word you can understand, a little bit of the colonizer or whoever is controlling you, and try to speak to someone who comes from Senegal. You don't know what he speaks. So over time, it becomes this hodgepodge of a language called Creole or Patois. In Sierra Leone, they have it. In Liberia, they have it. In Nigeria, they have the pidgin English because they can't speak to each other. So nobody prevented you. All you need is not to use your language because there is no one there to speak to, and the next generation, it's gone. The Jews, however, it was Jews. They took them as Jews. Even though they went from country to country to country, they were lucky enough to keep talking to each other because they can understand each other. So they were able to retain the language. This is my starting point. It happened to us on the continent. So don't be fooled. You hear countries like Nigeria, Ghana. If you ask 5 Ghanaians, one from the Ashanti, one from the Ewe, the Ga, the Akwamu, and the northern region, and ask them, are you Ghanaians? Yes, we are Ghanaians. Look at our passport. Ask them, what is Ghanaian culture? And they'll start looking at each other. There is no such thing. Ask them, what do you speak in Ghana? They'll start looking at each other. Ask them, what is the Ghanaian sense of value? There's no such thing. How do you guys marry in Ghana? There is no such thing. But you say you're Ghanaians. So what happened to us happened here. And when I arrived here, I understood it. When I went to Haiti, I was like, whoa. When I went to Jamaica, the same thing. So when I said, I was only speaking here, so I said African Americans. I would have said the same thing about my own countries in the continent. We have no culture.
Yeah, but from that video, what I got from it is you put Haitians on a pedestal.
I didn't. No, let me correct you.
When in comparison to Black Americans, you said Haitians, they have a culture. Like you said that out your mouth.
I said. So it was a long video about Haiti.
Mm-hmm.
And during that conversation, I began to talk about why Haitians can fix Haiti. Because you don't have Haitians. You have just a country forcefully imposed upon you a citizenship, but you are from different places in Africa. But right now, if you go somewhere, you would speak Creole. And somebody would say, oh, that is Haitian. That's what I meant. Not putting them on any pedestal.
So they have a language.
They created one.
So you want to say...
And it's not even useful in any way because it's not an international language.
So they took French and made Creole, right? Is what you're saying.
Spanish, French, and then over 200 African tribal languages into one.
But Americans would say that they took English and made their own language as well.
And what is that?
I mean, it's a broken version of English, but it's still something that we could speak to that's specifically to us.
What language is that?
I mean, it's English.
He's talking about
what that is
talking about
English.
AAVE, African American Vernacular English. The same way, for example,
I think I've heard, yes, when I came to this country in 1994, I had a debate on my campus about Ebonics.
Right.
Now,
same thing.
Yeah, and somebody corrected me. I think it was my professor said, no, if you say Ebonics, there is no one collective Ebonics.
Correct.
You have to go into pockets. If the person is from the north, the south, the central, they created their own style around it. So I understand that part. That didn't even qualify as a subculture. So let me give you, Jamaicans don't have a culture. When you say the country Jamaica, no, that is not identifiable as a culture. But the Rastafarians have a culture. Now, let me explain what I mean by worldview. The Rastafarians' worldview is that men were put on earth to take care of nature. Okay? That wealth, you have to create more than consume. So they live a frugal life. So politically, they are pacifists. They will never go to war. Socially, they are communal and what we call Epicurean. They believe getting high, eat some food, and have deep conversation is what life is about. And then religiously, they are Rastafarians. Hippies are the Western version of a Rastafarians. They also had a worldview. And that dictated their relationship with wealth. The hippies believe that humans were put on earth to create and consume. And that living in community and being frugal as to wearing the most, inexpensive clothing and using things together is what life is all about. So it guided how you see them dress, where they shop from, why they marry, on and on and on. That's what I mean by any society, if you want to understand them, it's the worldview. The Jews believe that they were put on earth as God's chosen people. That through them, that is a worldview. Now, any child told that, forget hurting one of them. Because they are driven by that. That is why they insist on having a community wherever they are. The Chinese, the white community. Do Africans that come from the continent have a community? We don't. Why? Because we don't have a culture. If we had, it would drive us to have a community. In the 50 states of the United States of America, African Americans don't have a community. They have neighborhoods. Now, people who got angry with me didn't even ask me, what does culture do anyway? What is it that I say you didn't have, that it makes you what? Nobody asked that question. What is that thing you're trying to hold on called culture, by the way? What is it?
You care to elaborate on that then? Now?
Now I'm asking. Once upon a time, John Lennon sang a song. Imagine we don't have religion. Imagine a world without religion, without heaven and hell. He believed in what? The brotherhood of mankind. Sure. So imagine the people without a culture. Maybe they are striving to a brotherhood of mankind. So you take words out of context, and then you crucify a man.
Right.
Not knowing that I am a victim of a cultureless country.
That's sometimes the risk.
I think we get angry too quickly. We're too sensitive. I was giving a talk, live talk the other day, and a gentleman, not the way David is behaving, he wrote the book and he said, my brother Frank, he doesn't know what this means to me. He called me on the phone and spoke with me. And we became friends like on the phone. And I said, I got to go. Even if it's 3 hours drive, if I have to fly, I'm going to see this gentleman. Because more than this conversation, there is someone here who really is a thinker. But we got to begin to tame down and accept criticism, because that is the only way societies were built in this world. In my live talk, I told this gentleman when he wouldn't get off my case, and I said, let me tell you something. You don't hate the white man. You don't even fear them. Because if black people hate and fear the white man the way they hate and fear each other, you would all have left this country at the end of slavery.
Left this country and go where?
Go where?
Yeah.
Where did the Jews go to? Do you know how many lands in Africa was offered to African Americans through the Black Star Line project? It was funded by a British through Marcus Garvey and Kwame Nkrumah, the Black Star Line. Did you go? No. How did you get the Amerigo-Liberia culture moved back? 3,400 people only agreed to go to Liberia. What do you mean where to? Plenty of land everywhere. Where did you come back from? How about the Caribbean?
See, that in and of itself.
But I'm not